He once described a meeting that changed the way he understood power forever. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy before something important happens. A senior manager leaned back in his chair and questioned a decision he had made in front of everyone. Not a simple question, the kind designed to challenge authority. In that moment, something instinctive happened. He started explaining, calmly at first, then with more detail, data, reasoning, strategy, everything carefully laid out. But as he spoke, he began noticing something uncomfortable. The more he explained, the more the atmosphere shifted. People weren't becoming more convinced. They were becoming more skeptical. And suddenly he realized something unsettling. Every extra sentence was slowly eroding his psychological dominance in the room. What most people don't realize is that conversations often hide an invisible battlefield, not of argument, but of perception. When someone begins to justify themselves too much, a subtle signal is transmitted. It may sound logical, even intelligent, but psychologically it reveals something deeper, the need for approval. And the moment that signal appears, the power dynamic quietly changes. The person questioning you suddenly gains control of the frame. It's a hidden mechanism of social manipulation that happens in offices, negotiations, friendships, and even families. The strange part is that almost nobody notices it while it's happening. They believe they are strengthening their position with logic, when in reality they are slowly surrendering authority. Then something unexpected happened. In the middle of his explanation, he stopped talking. Completely. The room fell into a strange silence. No more arguments, no more justifications, just calm presence. And in that moment, something fascinating occurred. The pressure shifted. The person who had challenged him suddenly began explaining their own concern, filling the silence, almost defending their position. That was the moment a hidden secret about psychological control became clear. Sometimes the fastest way to lose respect is to explain too much, and the fastest way to gain it is to stop. Because people who hold real power rarely feel the need to justify themselves. And once you understand this silent principle, you begin to see conversations in a completely different way. Most people have experienced that uncomfortable moment. Someone questions your decision, maybe in a meeting, maybe in a conversation with friends, maybe even within your own family. And almost instinctively, you begin to explain yourself. You talk about your reasons, your intentions, your logic. You want the other person to understand that you weren't careless, that you thought things through. So you keep talking, clarifying, adding more details, hoping that the next sentence will finally make them nod in agreement. But strangely, the opposite often happens. The more you explain, the more the other person seems unconvinced. And deep down, something begins to feel unsettling. As if every word is quietly weakening the confidence you had just a few moments before. What most people don't realize is that conversations are rarely just about facts or logic. Beneath every interaction, emotions are constantly shaping perception. People aren't only listening to what you say, they're sensing how certain you seem, how much control you hold over yourself, how unshakable your presence feels. And when someone explains too much, even with good intentions, it can unintentionally reveal something vulnerable. The desire to be understood, accepted, approved. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. It's deeply human. But in social dynamics, that small signal can quietly change how others perceive your authority, your confidence, and your psychological position in the room. Few people notice this while it's happening. They believe respect comes from proving themselves again and again, explaining every choice, defending every idea. But the strange truth is, that the individuals who carry the strongest presence often do the opposite. They don't rush to justify themselves. They speak with calm clarity, and then they stop. There's a quiet confidence in their silence, a subtle mastery that communicates something powerful without needing many words. And when someone learns this hidden shift, the difference between explaining to be understood and explaining to seek approval, something inside their behavior begins to change. Their presence becomes calmer, more strategic, almost unshakable, and that realization opens the door to a deeper question about human psychology. Why do we feel such a strong urge to explain ourselves in the first place? There's a subtle psychological pattern that appears in almost every environment. Meetings, friendships, negotiations, even family dinners. Someone questions a decision, and immediately the other person begins explaining everything. The reasoning, the context, the details. On the surface, it seems reasonable. But beneath that moment lives a hidden psychological dynamic that few people ever notice. Over-explaining often isn't about clarity. It's about protection. Protection from judgment. Protection from rejection. The mind quietly believes that if it provides enough information, enough logic, enough justification, then control of the situation will return. But paradoxically, the opposite often happens. Every extra explanation can unintentionally signal uncertainty, and uncertainty slowly weakens perceived authority. What was meant to strengthen confidence begins to erode it. He once recalled a situation during a strategic meeting early in his career. One colleague was presenting a proposal, and every time someone asked a question, he responded with long explanations. 10 minutes turned into 20. Every small doubt triggered another wave of details, more arguments, more reasoning. The presenter clearly wanted respect and validation for the idea. But something fascinating happened in the room. The more he explained, the more the audience sensed hesitation. The energy shifted. People who had no strong opinion suddenly began questioning more, not because the idea was weak, but because the excessive explanation created psychological openings for doubt. Meanwhile, another colleague in the same meeting spoke only twice. Calm, precise sentences, delivered with quiet confidence. And strangely enough, that person carried more dominance in the room. This is where a powerful secret about social dynamics becomes revealed. People with strong psychological presence rarely feel the need to defend every thought. Their silence communicates something deeper than words. Certainty. It doesn't mean they avoid communication. It means they practice strategic communication. If someone questions their decision, they answer clearly, but without surrendering control of the interaction. No emotional urgency. No need to convince everyone. Just calm authority. And when people sense that unshakable confidence, respect begins to appear almost automatically. But this raises a fascinating question. If explaining too much quietly weakens authority, why do so many intelligent and capable people still fall into that trap every day? There's something fascinating happening beneath almost every conversation, though most people never notice it. Whenever two or more people interact, an invisible hierarchy quietly begins to form. No one announces it. No one votes on it, yet it shapes who feels respected, who feels heard, and who subtly controls the direction of the interaction. It's not always about job titles, intelligence, or status. Very often, it's about psychological presence. The person who appears calm, centered, and unshakable tends to occupy the higher position in that invisible structure. And here's where things become interesting. People who constantly seek validation through explanations unknowingly lower their position in that hierarchy, even if their ideas are brilliant. Imagine a conversation where one person keeps saying things like, "Let me explain why I did that," or "I just want you to understand my reasoning." On On the surface, it sounds thoughtful and cooperative. But psychologically, something subtle happens. The moment someone tries too hard to convince others, it signals a shift in power. The person is no longer simply communicating a decision. They are asking for approval. And once that signal appears, the dynamic of control begins to move. The listener unconsciously takes a higher position in the interaction. Meanwhile, someone who speaks with clarity and brevity often appears far more confident. A simple sentence like, "That's the direction we're taking," carries a surprising amount of authority when it's delivered with calm confidence and strategic silence. He once observed this dynamic in a negotiation between two executives. One of them spoke for nearly 15 minutes explaining every possible detail of the proposal, trying to anticipate objections before they even appeared. The other listened quietly, occasionally nodding, barely interrupting. And when it was finally his turn to speak, he said only a few sentences, clear, measured, almost effortless. But the entire room leaned toward him. That's the strange nature of psychological dominance in conversations. Authority rarely comes from the number of words someone uses. It comes from the certainty behind them. And when someone learns to speak with strategic restraint instead of constant justification, something powerful begins to happen. Because silence itself can start creating a kind of pressure most people aren't prepared to handle. There's a moment in many conversations that most people rush to escape. Silence. That brief pause after a question, when the room becomes still and everyone waits for someone to speak. For many people, that silence feels uncomfortable, almost threatening. The mind immediately tries to fill the space with explanations, clarifications, and additional details. But here's a psychological secret that experienced negotiators, skilled leaders, and strategic communicators understand very well. Silence is not empty. Silence is pressure. When someone resists the urge to explain and instead holds calm eye contact, something subtle begins to happen in the mind of the other person. The dynamic shifts. The pressure that once pushed you to justify yourself slowly moves to the person who asked the question. Imagine someone challenging a decision you made. Most people immediately respond with a long explanation, but a strategic communicator might simply say something like, "That's the decision." Then they stop talking. No defensiveness, no urgency, no attempt at manipulation. Just calm authority and silence. At first, the pause may feel uncomfortable, but then something interesting begins to happen. The other person often starts filling the silence themselves. They begin explaining their concern, clarifying what they meant, sometimes even softening their own position. Why does this happen? Because silence forces the other person's mind to process the situation. Without extra explanations to react to, their attention turns inward, reconsidering their own assumptions. He once saw this dynamic during a tense project discussion. One manager was questioned repeatedly about a decision. Instead of launching into a long justification, he calmly answered the question in one short sentence and then leaned back in his chair. Silence followed. A few seconds later, the person who had challenged him began talking again, but this time they were the one explaining their reasoning. The entire energy of the room shifted. The manager hadn't used arguments, persuasion, or control through words. His confidence alone created psychological dominance. That's the quiet mastery of strategic silence. And once someone begins to understand this principle, they start noticing something even more revealing. Some people intentionally provoke explanations, because explanations give them power. There's a pattern that becomes obvious once you start paying attention to human behavior. Some people don't ask questions because they genuinely want to understand. They ask questions to keep you explaining. At first, the interaction seems harmless, a small doubt here, a clarification there. But slowly the conversation turns into a loop where you're constantly justifying yourself. Every answer creates space for another question, another objection, another subtle challenge. This is one of the oldest psychological manipulation tactics in social dynamics. The person isn't trying to reach truth. They are trying to maintain control of the conversation. And explanations are the fuel that keeps that cycle alive. Think about situations you may have already experienced. Someone says, "I'm just trying to understand," but every time you answer, another question appears, then another, and another. Before you realize it, you've spent 20 minutes defending a decision that didn't even require justification in the first place. Manipulators understand something most people overlook. When you keep explaining yourself, you slowly surrender control of the interaction. Your energy becomes defensive. Your tone becomes persuasive instead of authoritative. And the person asking the questions quietly becomes the one guiding the conversation. It's a subtle shift, but a powerful one. The conversation stops being about the original decision and becomes about whether you can convince them. This is why people with strong psychological presence learn an important form of mastery. They don't play the endless explanation game. They answer clearly once, then they stop. No irritation, no emotional reaction, no visible frustration. Just calm confidence. If another question appears that serves no real purpose, they don't rush to fill the silence with more justification. Instead, they hold their position with quiet authority. And interestingly enough, manipulators often lose interest when their strategy stops working, because without explanations, they lose the leverage they were trying to create. But this raises a deeper insight about power and communication. The real strength isn't in arguing better. It's in knowing when silence becomes the most strategic response. Você gostou do tópico 4? Ou quer ajustar algo? Talvez deixar mais estratégico, mais psicológico, ou adicionar exemplos mais fortes de manipulação no dia a dia? Many people misunderstand silence. They believe that saying less might make them appear distant, arrogant, or even unprepared. But strategic silence has nothing to do with arrogance. In fact, it often reflects a deeper level of emotional control and psychological mastery. When someone is truly confident in their decisions, they don't feel an urgent need to prove themselves to everyone in the room. Their confidence feels steady, almost unshakable. They speak when necessary, with clarity and purpose, and then they allow the silence to do part of the work. That quiet presence carries a kind of authority that endless explanations rarely achieve. It's a subtle form of dominance that doesn't rely on force or manipulation, but on calm certainty. Think about individuals you naturally respect. Experienced leaders, strong mentors, or even someone in your life who seems to command attention without trying too hard. Often those individuals don't rush to fill every pause in a conversation. They listen carefully. When they finally speak, their words are measured and intentional. A simple statement delivered with confidence can carry far more power than a long argument filled with justifications. Strategic silence works in a similar way to a pause in music. The pause isn't empty. It gives weight to the notes that came before it. In communication, silence creates space for people to absorb what was said, and that space often amplifies the perception of authority and control. He once observed this during a leadership training session, where two managers were discussing a difficult decision. One of them explained every possible detail, anticipating objections and trying to win everyone's agreement. The other listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When it was his turn to speak, he simply said, "I've considered the risks, and this is the direction we're taking." Then he stopped. No defensive tone, no elaborate justification, just calm confidence. And interestingly, the room accepted the statement almost immediately. That's the hidden power of strategic silence. It communicates something deeper than logic. It communicates certainty. And when people sense that certainty, something remarkable begins to happen in the way they respond to you. Something fascinating begins to happen the moment a person stops explaining every decision. At first, the change feels almost uncomfortable. The instinct to justify, clarify, and persuade still whispers in the background. But when someone learns to hold their position with calm confidence instead of constant explanation, the social atmosphere begins to shift in subtle ways. Conversations become shorter, clearer, and strangely more respectful. People interrupt less. Questions become more thoughtful instead of confrontational. It's not because you suddenly became more intelligent or more prepared. It's because your presence now communicates something powerful. Certainty. When someone appears unshakable in their decisions, others instinctively sense that psychological stability and begin adjusting their behavior around it. Many people notice the first change in small everyday interactions. A colleague who used to question every detail suddenly stops pushing so hard. A friend who used to challenge your choices begins listening more carefully. Even difficult personalities often soften when they realize they can no longer pull you into endless explanations. This doesn't happen through manipulation or control tactics. It happens because your communication becomes more strategic. Instead of trying to convince everyone, you simply express your position with clarity and confidence. A short sentence like, "That's what I decided after reviewing the situation," carries far more authority when it's delivered calmly than a 5-minute justification filled with defensive energy. Over time, this shift creates something even more interesting. A transformation in how people perceive your psychological presence. Respect starts appearing in places where it didn't exist before, not because you demanded it, but because your behavior signals quiet mastery and emotional stability. People trust individuals who seem internally grounded. They feel safer following someone who doesn't constantly seek validation. And slowly, your words begin to carry more weight, even though you're speaking less. That's the paradox of strategic communication. Influence doesn't always grow through more words. Sometimes it grows through restraint, and once someone experiences that transformation firsthand, they begin to see conversations and power in a completely different light. There's a quiet difference that changes everything once you begin to notice it. Some people explain because they want to clarify an idea. Others explain because they need approval. At first glance, these two things seem identical. The words may sound the same. The tone may even feel similar. But psychologically, they come from completely different places. One comes from confidence. The other comes from uncertainty. And people can feel that difference, even if they can't explain it. Think about the last time you saw someone speak with real authority. Not arrogance, not manipulation, just calm confidence. They didn't rush to defend themselves. They didn't try to win every argument. They simply expressed their decision and let the silence hold the weight of their words. That kind of presence creates something powerful. Respect. Not the kind you demand, not the kind you negotiate, but the kind that appears naturally when people sense psychological stability and inner mastery. Because here's a hidden truth most people never learn. The more someone tries to convince everyone, the less convincing they become. Real authority rarely argues. Real confidence rarely over-explains. Real dominance is quiet, controlled, and unshakable. And when a person finally understands this secret, conversations begin to feel different. The pressure disappears. The need to prove yourself fades. Decisions become clearer. Words become fewer. And strangely enough, respect starts appearing where it never existed before. So here's a question worth reflecting on. How many times have you explained yourself when silence would have carried more power? How many conversations could have changed if you simply trusted your own authority instead of trying to convince everyone? The moment you stop explaining everything is often the moment people start listening differently. And sometimes, the strongest statement you can make is simply refusing to justify yourself. If this idea changed the way you see conversations and psychological power, take a second to engage with the video. Leave a like so more people can discover this hidden dynamic. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications, because here we explore the deeper strategies behind human behavior, authority, and psychological mastery.